Welcome into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and there's quite a bit to get to today for Week 3's wide receiver rankings. These will not be my complete rankings. I believe we're going through maybe my top 45 wide receivers, so deeper leagues, etc. Maybe you need more than that. Well, there's more than that. It's available up on the website at www.theffforge.com. Down in the description, you can find a link, as well as it being right below me right now. Also, this sheet that you're going to be seeing today is a living, breathing sheet that gets updated throughout the week as news comes in and as rankings change. So these will not be my final rankings. They will be updated throughout the week. Or you could just come and visit me live 1 hour prior to kickoff on Sunday for my last rankings and to ask any start-sit questions that you may have. Before we get into my Week 3 wide receiver rankings, we're just going to do a quick recap of how I did last week with my love-ems, my fade-ems, as well as my DFS buy recommendations, whatever you want to call them. And there will be some of those at the end of this video. But last week, I suggested a DJ Moore at 5,500. He ended up with 13.4 fantasy points, so I think he was okay for the price. Didn't really win you the week, though, unfortunately. But in a smaller tournament type of situation, should have been good enough there. And then I had his brother, not really, Elijah Moore, and that did not go so well. When we look at my love-ems, I had Tyler Lockett, who finished 6th on the week. This is half PPR. Then Deebo Samuel finished 14th on the week, so I did really good with those two love-ems. For the wide receivers, I will give you 3 love-ems, 3 fade-ems. And my third love-em was DeAndre Hopkins, but that was before we knew about any of the injury or anything like that. Definitely did not love him once all of that came about. So I don't know if you want to count that against me. That's up to you. Then for my fade-ems, I did terrible. Should have been love-ems, I guess. Garrett Wilson, Drake London, who finished 21st, and George Pickens. Garrett Wilson, George Pickens, I think the process was there for the most part, but maybe I underappreciated the talents that they are and the fact that one big play is all it takes for either of them to have a good fantasy week. And Drake London just did good, had more targets and everything, so that was good to see for him going forward. Now, on to going forward, Week 3, my wide receiver rankings. We're going to start off with my first tier, which is 12 players. And all of these guys are really must-start options, so there's not much of a point to talking about them. Monroe St. Brown does apparently have a turf toe injury, so that's not great. It could be very minor, could be something more than that. We will find out. I think he's expected to be playing, though, in the game at least, so that's good. And then as far as Jamar Chase, both of the receivers for Cincinnati, obviously, if there is no Joe Burrow, that would change things, and it is a little bit concerning regardless. So from wide receiver 1 to 12, I have Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, A.J. Brown, Keenan Allen, Amon-Ra St. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Devonta Smith, Jamar Chase, Devontae Adams, Calvin Ridley, and Chris Olave. My second tier of wide receivers is a little bit smaller, going from wide receiver 13 to 17. It goes as so: Mike Evans, followed by Puka Nacua, T. Higgins, Brandon Ayuk, still up here. We'll see about that if I feel comfortable with that, but I really like the matchup for him. I'll get to that in just a moment. And Deebo Samuel. So when we look at Mike Evans, Puka Nacua, T. Higgins, as far as Mike Evans goes, he's had a good amount of targets, and he's done well with them so far this season, and he is in one of the better wide receiver matchups up until this point in the season. I feel comfortable starting him this week. Philadelphia has been pretty banged up in their secondary. Then Puka Nacua, it feels really weird having him up this high, and Cincinnati has not been a great matchup for wide receivers this far into the season, but there's also that upside with it. And it's been really impressive through 2 weeks, and the wide receiver landscape's kind of ugly pretty quickly. So he earned being ranked quite highly this week. Then T. Higgins, I'm going to push him up higher if there's good news on Joe Burrow and that injury. Just depending on the news cycle surrounding that situation, he could fluctuate. And then as far as Brandon Ayuk, my wide receiver is 16. In 2022, the New York Giants ran the most man defense out of any team in the NFL, and he feasts against man defenses. The injury is a concern, though. The optimistic side of me says even if he's limited, similar to last week, like at least they'll be using him in high value situations around the goal line once they get within 20 yards of the goal line, that kind of stuff, which would really help his output. But of course, volume is king, and it looks like we can probably not expect a full workload for Brandon Ayuk right now. So we'll see about my ranking on him. That'll bring us to my third tier of wide receivers. We have Tyler Lockett in at wide receiver 18, followed by DK Metcalf, Chris Godwin, and George Pickens in at wide receiver 21. As far as Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf go, I think you should temper your expectations this week, but you're still starting either of these two in most situations. I have Ayuk that I'm going to have to decide whether I want to play him over Tyler Lockett or not, have him ranked ahead of Tyler Lockett right now. It's a close call. And yes, I'm still going to be ranking Tyler Lockett ahead of DK Metcalf for now. Then at wide receiver 21 with George Pickens, he is a love him for me. I'm expecting this offense to settle in and finally get into a groove against a much easier defense than they have faced over the first 2 weeks against the Las Vegas Raiders. And I believe that George could definitely feast this week, which is why I love him. I have another smaller tier here, starting off at wide receiver 22 with Nico Collins, and wide receiver 23 with Mike Williams, who I have a fadeum on, going up against Minnesota and Jacksonville. Both of those defenses so far have allowed almost an identical amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Nico Collins, however, is 7th in fantasy points on the season and has the 6th most targets among wide receivers. Meanwhile, Mike Williams is 38th via average fantasy points per week, and his targets actually aren't so bad through the first couple of weeks. He is tied for 14th most targets. If we are going to reward Puka Nacua for what he has done so far this season, then we were also going to be rewarding Nico Collins for what he has done in another matchup where we should definitely expect Houston to have to pass a lot against Jacksonville, assuming that Jacksonville can get their offense going this week. And at wide receiver 24, I have Amari Cooper going up against Tennessee. They have allowed the 5th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far this season. And at wide receiver 25, I have DJ Moore. And there are plenty of reasons to shy away from DJ Moore this week. I'm going to be giving him one more chance here in a matchup where the Bears should be playing catch-up throughout most of the game, going up against Kansas City Chiefs. So, I'm taking a shot at him one more time. He did okay last week, too. And that's going to bring us to a larger tier here, kicking it off at wide receiver 26 with Terry McLaurin, followed by one of my fadeums in Garrett Wilson going up against New England. I have him 5 spots behind the ECR at wide receiver 27. So as of Tuesday evening, Garrett Wilson would have been wide receiver 22. New England actually hasn't been a super tough matchup for wide receivers so far this season. I am still concerned about Garrett Wilson's floor, however. To me, it feels like he's been fairly lucky over the first 2 weeks with Zach Wilson at quarterback. Still, I do have to respect the fact that he can take it to the house on any given play, which is why, part of why at least, I have him ranked higher than I had him last week. I'll probably jump him ahead of Terry McLaurin, but I just have an unexplainable feeling that Terry McLaurin is going to be having a good week this week. I can't explain it, but I think it's possible. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 28 in Drake London, who I put a love 'em tag on, and just as a reminder, these love 'ems, fadeums, I just don't want to give you, I could, pick some fadeums that are wide receiver 50s and below, or some love 'ems that are in my top 12 wide receivers, must-start guys. Not trying to give you those names, trying to take a little bit of a risk here and explain why I think these guys might have a really big week. It's not always going to work out. So for Drake London, I am playing against the matchup here, going up against the Detroit Lions. I'm 4 spots higher than the ECR. The Lions just lost Chauncey Gardner-Johnson to injury, and that's going to help a lot against an already good matchup, the 3rd best matchup for wide receivers up to this point in the season. If you're not playing Drake London this week, then I don't know why you drafted him. Moving on to wide receiver 29, we have Zay Flowers, and at wide receiver 30, we have another love 'em in Jordan Addison going up against the Los Angeles Chargers, having 5 spots ahead of the ECR. And KJ Osborne continues to just drop balls in big situations, pretty easy catches. I think we saw some of that last year. We're seeing it again this year. And we saw Jordan's snap share jump from 56% in week 1 all the way up to 69% last week. We absolutely love Kirk Cousins. I'm not the only one this week going up against the Chargers for a reason. So look for Jordan Addison to continue to increase his workload in week 3 and potentially find the end zone for the 3rd week in a row. Wide receiver 31, I have Christian Watson, 7 spots ahead of ECR. His ECR will settle in differently if he's, given the green light that he'll be going at any one point. Wide receiver 32, I have Michael Pittman, and I am concerned about the ceiling for Michael Pittman this week, but I really do like the floor quite a bit. The Baltimore secondary can be had, and I'm definitely not opposed to starting Pittman this week. Gardner Minshew targeted him plenty once he started in last week's game, but his average yards per reception with Gardner Minshew was 6.3 yards. That is just about exactly half of what it was week 1 with Anthony Richardson. Wide receiver 33, I have DeAndre Hopkins going up against Cleveland, 2 spots behind ECR and him as of Tuesday evening. And the Browns are still the second worst matchup for wide receivers this season so far. And Hopkins doesn't have the speed to make one big play like George Pickens does. So I am banking against a big play and just, kind of a Michael Pittman-esque game against a worse defense, though, which is why I have him behind, a harder matchup on defense against Cleveland, Michael Pittman having the better matchup there against Baltimore. So, yeah, I'm not too excited about Hopkins' ceiling. The floor, target-wise, as long as he's fully healthy, should be there. That's another concern. Is he going to be fully healthy, or is he still going to be kind of coming back? Wide receiver 34, I have Michael Thomas. Wide receiver 35, I have Jahan Dotson. And I'll just look at him versus my wide receiver 36, Jerry Jeudy. Both of them a little bit behind ECR. Going up against Buffalo for Jahan Dotson and Miami for Jerry Jeudy. And both receivers have lots of upside in those matchups. But they also have very risky floors. Buffalo and Miami are both bottom 5 matchups for wide receivers so far this season. That said, this is a small sample size in week 1. Buffalo got the New York Jets with their backup quarterback playing, which makes that even tougher for them to come in without preparing throughout the week. And he's not a good, quarterback, really. So, asterisk there on being a top 5 passing defense. And also, Jahan Dotson so far has been targeted more on average per week than Jerry Jeudy. It's Jerry Jeudy 1 game sample size, but Jerry Jeudy is back for his second week. Little optimism for him after coming back from injury here, so expect his workload to increase, him to maybe be more efficient, those kinds of things. But will he be fully efficient and fully utilized as far as his snap share? That's still up for debate. And that's going to bring us to the last tier of wide receivers here. Starting off at wide receiver 37, we have Christian Kirk, followed by Gabe Davis, Elijah Moore, Rashid Shaheed, who I have a little note about at wide receiver 40, going up against the Green Bay Packers. I have him 5 spots ahead of ECR, and I'm not going to argue against him being lower. He is who he is. He's not going to be a safe play in any given week, at least most likely. I don't think that you can rely on him week in and week out, but he has started the season strong, and the Packers typically haven't dealt well with teams who have a lot of weapons when they can't just focus in on one guy and shut him down. So I'm looking for Rashid Shaheed to get a couple of opportunities against the shaky safeties of the Green Bay Packers, while most of the attention is focused on Chris Olave and Michael Thomas, and take advantage of that, just like he could do all season long, but they are riskier targets that he gets, and he has a low floor because of the target share and the amount of targets that he gets in any given game, but I do like the matchup for him this week fairly well. Then I have Romeo Doubs in at wide receiver 41. Don't love that, don't hate that. Wide receiver 42, I have Cortland Sutton. And at wide receiver 43, we have Josh Reynolds going up against Atlanta. I have him 12 spots higher than the ECR. I didn't check. I checked on Jacoby Myers this morning, and I'm much closer to ECR there. So we'll get to that in a moment. I didn't double check Josh Reynolds. Look, Amon-Ra St. Brown is apparently suffering from turf toe, so I'm looking for Josh Reynolds to at least continue to get targeted at the decent rate that he already has been, and possibly more than normal, and that should result in a solid day here. Then at wide receiver 44, I do have Jacoby Myers going up against Pittsburgh, and I was 16 spots higher than him when I did these last night on Tuesday evening, but as of this morning, I'm only 9 spots higher than him on ECR. I'm totally expecting him to come back from his concussion. So assuming he's back this week, I'm willing to give him a chance. He had one of the highest target shares in the league in week 1, and he averages the second most fantasy points per game. That is over one single game, not a great sample size. Of course, none of these are great sample sizes to work from at this point in the season. This Pittsburgh defense has allowed points to receivers through 2 weeks, so it's not as daunting of a task as it appeared to be week 2 against Cleveland. Week 1 looked under impressive, not as impressive as we expected this Pittsburgh defense to be. And week 2, they kind of looked like God eaters. Which one is it? I'm not sure, but I am willing to take a shot on Jacoby, who should not be hampered from any kind of lingering effects from the concussion, assuming he does come back. A lot of times guys will be able to come back from a concussion with no real reduction to their expected production. And last up in that tier, I have Marquise Brown in at wide receiver 45. I do have one wide receiver that's not in my top 45 who was in the ECR top 45 that I looked at last night. Tutu Atwell going up against Cincinnati. He is a wide receiver 2 on the season so far, and Cincinnati is a fairly tough matchup for wide receivers up until this point in the season. I struggle to fully trust it despite him being a wide receiver 2 so far on the season. So I'm not overly excited to go ahead and start him. That's going to bring us to my DFS buys for the week. Once again, you can find my full wide receiver rankings up on the website at www.theffforge.com. As far as my DFS buys, got a few names for you. So first of all, assuming that Jalen Waddle misses the week, River Craycraft is the guy that we would expect to kind of come in and take that role. He has shown a good connection with Tua last season and offseason this season. So at $3,400, he is an interesting buy. And if you want to get weird, you could always go for Eric Izukanma. He is, for a big tournament kind of guy at $3,000. He probably won't do anything, but he could. I really liked him coming out of as a prospect, not an early round prospect or anything like that. Just think he has a really, really interesting skill set. Maybe they develop a game plan that kind of utilizes that more this week. He looked pretty good last week in a few opportunities that he had. Then a cheap option that probably won't get used a lot is going to be Darius Slayton at $4,200. San Francisco as a defense who they're going up against New York Giants. It can be had deep. It's a short week. Weird things happen on short weeks, so I think that you could make a worse contrarian play. I'm not expecting him to have a high percentage of usage for week-long tournaments that you could use him in. Then for a mid-priced option, I'm going to go with George Pickens here at $5,300. He's looking like the best deal out of my Love'ems, but that said, all of the Love'ems that I have on this list are decently priced, well-priced. I wouldn't mind throwing any of them into a lineup, and Puka Nacua and Nico also seem to be safe options at their price points. So that is it. Thank you very, very much for tuning in. If you made it this far, please like, comment, subscribe. The running backs video will come out tomorrow morning, and the tight ends video will come out on Friday. So you have George Kittle, Darren Waller. Most likely you're going to play him. You can always ask in the comments if you have someone that you're thinking about playing over them, what my opinion is, what my ranking is. You can also just look at my rankings. They're up on the website already, www.theffforge.com. Peace out.